Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in to today's episode. I am a little dusty, having only gotten to bed at around 2 a.m. last night, which is not typical for me in the least, but there was a good reason. I was in Sydney for the What Bitcoin Did event with Peter McCormick, and what an event it was. And I guess the reason why I'm telling you this is because I've heard more and more Bitcoiners uh, tell their journey about how it was really lonely being a Bitcoin in the beginning. You often think differently to people, you can't relate to other people in some ways. And when you get together with Bitcoiners, you realize, hey, there's people who think kind of like me in some way, and they're also fairly intelligent. So it's really, I guess, reassuring in one sense, but at the same time, so invigorating and stimulating in so many ways. Like I literally couldn't sleep, and it was 2 a.m. and I thought, my God, man, how exciting is this? So yeah, strongly encourage you to go to any event. A couple of events here in Australia. There's a Bush Bash in Murrurundi in November, and there's also Bitcoin Alive in March of next year. So that's for Australia, and of course, there's a ton overseas within the States or Europe. So do yourself a favor and go to one of those if you've never been. All right, so over to today's episode. I have got Jimmy Song, and Jimmy doesn't need much of an introduction, let's be honest. He's a programmer, but more so known as a prolific writer. And we spoke about his fifth book, Fiat Ruins Everything. And I really enjoyed this one because I thought I had some really good ideas and a good framework about some of the challenges with the fiat system, how it skews incentives, etc. But I couldn't always articulate it as well. And Jimmy knocked it out of the park. So if you've ever had any difficulties explaining it to friends or family, maybe you can just send this one on to them because I think they might appreciate it. We spoke about things like food, we spoke about family, also chatted a bit about Binance and crypto. I really think you'll enjoy the episode, and I think you'll hear how I started putting pieces of a puzzle together as we were going through the conversation. Last but not least, I wanted to dedicate this episode to my right hand man, Benny Bitcoin Warburton. He was my 2-year-old King Charles Cavalier dog who unfortunately passed away this past week in a tragic accident. I've been really touched by all the outpouring of love and support from the community. It means the world to me. He was like a son, and it's been really devastating, but it's been so amazing to see people reaching out from all around the world. So thank you all. I sincerely appreciate it on behalf of myself and my family. Okay, so that's enough from me. Let's get on with the show.
Which one's the best crypto asset? Well, Bitcoin's the best crypto asset. Okay. What's the second best? There is no second best. There is no second best crypto asset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Why Bitcoin Show. I'm your host, Dale Warburton. It's a weekly podcast on why Bitcoin matters and what makes it completely different to all other cryptocurrencies. If you're interested in Bitcoin and you'd like to distill crypto fact from fiction, you've come to the right place.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to introduce a man from Austin, Texas, the one and only Jimmy Song. Welcome to the Why Bitcoin Show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Super. Yeah, Jimmy, I'm a long-time fan. You're an educator, you're a programmer, you've been in the space forever. I think now your book that's soon to be released will be your fifth. I think most people are familiar with you, but if you wouldn't mind just giving us just a high-level sort of 30-second overview as to who you are, just in terms of, for those who might not necessarily be familiar with your work, Jimmy.
Yeah, so I'm a programmer by trade, and I've been in the Bitcoin space since 2011 or so. I do write a lot, and I have I also contribute to various Bitcoin open source projects and everything. And the easiest way to describe me is as a Bitcoin expert.
Perfect. Absolutely. Okay, super. Well, Jimmy, I thought just one of the reasons I wanted to get you on there was I really want to talk about how Fiat Ruins Everything. That's the title of your new book, and I'm really keen to dive into all the different aspects of our life. There it is. I want to chat about all the different aspects of our life that are impacted by fiat, and I don't think it's necessarily well understood by a lot of people. But given sort of what the show is about, I was wondering if you could give us your sort of overall take on crypto versus Bitcoin. How do you explain crypto as being distinct, at least to people who are kind of new to the space?
Yeah, the easiest way to think about it is just to learn about Bitcoin more specifically than quote unquote crypto. Bitcoin is decentralized, digital, and scarce. That's what makes it unique from every other asset that's ever existed in the world. And it's scarce because of the 21 million limit. And generally, when something is scarce, there's a strong incentive to go get more of it. And in particular, with money, which is a commodity that's used as a medium of exchange in any economy, people generally like it better when it's decentralized as opposed to centralized. When it's centralized, the controller of the currency can make more of it, and it means that there's a lot of different ways in which it can get stolen. Now, traditionally, the decentralized scarce money that was used was gold, and up until 2009 all digital currencies were centralized. That is, if it were, you kind of had to choose between decentralized or digital. And what Satoshi Nakamoto introduced was something that was decentralized, digital, and scarce. And that's something that we've never really had before. Altcoins generally are copies of Bitcoin without that decentralized aspect. There is a controller of the currency that can print more of it or do something with it. And that's the main difference, is that Bitcoin is decentralized. Altcoins, or quote unquote crypto, is centralized. And in that way, it's not really different than any other sort of digital centralized thing that existed before. Bitcoin is a real innovation, and it gives us lots of different properties. But altcoins are not anything new, and you can kind of see it because they are continuously creating more of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about the decentralized aspect, I mean, the one is the fact that you got rulers. I guess with Bitcoin, it's a rules based as opposed to a ruler based system. But do you also think about, when it comes to decentralization, the fact that you can actually run a node? Is that something that's important in your mind as evidence of decentralization?
Yeah. So with something like the US dollar, that is centralized and digital and scarce, at least relatively speaking. But the reason why it's kind of sucky as a store of value, for example, is that you can never really verify how many dollars exist. They're constantly sort of creating more dollars through loans and so on. So you have no idea. And, if you're like a Ron Paul fan, you know that the Federal Reserve is not audited. What Bitcoin node software lets you do is constantly audit Bitcoin. You know exactly how many Bitcoin exist at any one time, and all new transactions have to pass certain tests, like it's not creating any new Bitcoin except for particular types that are introducing new coins into existence every 10 minutes and so on. So it's verifiable, and what running your own node lets you do is verify everything. You don't have to trust anybody. And in that way, it's also decentralized because there's no authority. There's no person in charge that's sort of saying, hey, here's how many there are, and you have to trust us. Just what's happened with every fiat currency. Instead, you can verify yourself by running some relatively lightweight software.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair enough. And if we were to try, I like to try and steelman, my opponent's arguments as much as possible. So when I think about these cryptocurrencies, and I think briefly before we started recording, I mentioned, given my background in South Africa, I think I'm always acutely aware of some of the problems in Africa. One of the things they have an issue with is having access to the US dollar, which for, I guess, folks in the US isn't necessarily like, they'll go look at Bitcoin as an investment, but I suppose in parts of Africa, they just want to get their hands on the soundest fiat currency they can. And through things like stable coins, whether it's on Tron or Ethereum, it represents something better than their local fiat currency. Bless you.
Thank you.
So, that is one of the things I grapple with, and I tend to struggle with when people say, "Well, if shitcoins are so useless, then explain to me, the stablecoin side of things." What's your take of that? In terms of stablecoins?
Well, I think stable coins are not really altcoins per se. They're substitutes of the actual fiat underneath currency, right? So when you're talking about Tether, for example, it has many layers of centralization, not the least of which is the company that runs Tether. If you and it's at their pleasure that Tether is convertible to US dollars. And generally, if you do that, it has to be in a certain quantity and you have to go through a bunch of KYC checks and so on. But that's how it works. And really what they're running is kind of a bank, right? Like you have some claims for the dollars that they have in their account, and you are able to redeem them using this thing. Now, the fact that it's traded as a token on these various networks or whatever is just sort of like a convenience. They could just as easily do it using some sort of database on their website. It's that centralized. It really doesn't need to be on any of these things. It's just that's how they chose to deploy it. And in many ways, I think they could do other things like use something like Xiaomi and eCash to give their users privacy or whatever. And in many ways, like the blockchain is the wrong tool for this job. But it is popular because what people want are the underneath things, which is the dollar. And currently, it trades at par because a lot of people trust Tether, the company. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It could get rug pulled at any time for any number of reasons. But that doesn't mean that it's completely useless or something like that. In fact, a lot of people find it useful, just the same way that they find the dollar useful. It's legal tender. It is the world reserve currency. So having something that is convertible to that, of course, can be useful. It'd be like if you had something that was convertible, like a coupon that was convertible for, I don't know, burrito or something like that. Of course, that's useful in the sense that you can convert it to something like that, and maybe it can even trade. But it's not it's not an altcoin in the sense like Ethereum or Cardano or something, which is completely made out of nothing and created as basically a Fiat 2.0 currency. This is more like Fiat 1.0. It's really like the dollar. It's just accounted for through various ledger mechanisms on these other platforms.
Yeah. And then on a long enough time horizon, do you think they'll all go to zero against Bitcoin, or do you think there'll just be this like long tail of relatively worthless blockchains?
Yeah, I think altcoins generally will go to zero, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. There's already been many that have gone to zero against Bitcoin or even against the dollar. Some of the earliest altcoins to exist from August of 2011, like do you even know what Geistgeld is or IX coin or
No.
or Tenebricks? Like most people have no idea what these are. Yeah, because they died many years ago. And there's many more like that. And every cycle you see the previous generation of altcoins having mostly died. It's maybe a few of them survive or whatever, but a lot of them just go away, right? Even the top, and some of them were in the top 10 at one point. But that's how things are. And that's part of the gambly nature of these things.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. Sort of in summary, I tend to describe all the other cryptocurrencies really as sort of software projects or companies. They can call themselves foundations, but I fundamentally look at them as companies, liquid venture capital tokens, and then you look at Bitcoin, that's actually money. So yeah, let's shift gears now. Let's ditch the crypto stuff. I want to talk now a little bit about Bitcoin now. So you've got this book that's coming out, Fiat Ruins Everything, and I think there it is. And I think at a high level, when I'm trying to describe Bitcoin as solving a lot of the world's problems, and we'll tend to use this sort of Bitcoin fixes this meme. We can talk about how sound money creates good incentives, and that can just change all sorts of things in society, from the food we eat to the medicine to politics to corruption. And so at a high level, I do believe and I subscribe to that. What I sometimes struggle to do is articulate that to ordinary people. And typically it's in a soundbite. Someone will go like, tell me exactly how they fix this. So I was wondering if you could maybe, let's start from the beginning, sort of your overall thesis on how fiat ruins things, and then we can dive into some specifics that you find particularly interesting and that the audience might find valuable.
Yeah, so the main thesis of the book is that fiat does ruin a lot of things, everything, right? And the reason I say that is because fiat money is basically half of every transaction that's made in the market, right? And the fact that somebody can print essentially an infinite amount of it means that the incentives get skewed all over the place. And when you say something like Bitcoin fixes this, it's not so much that Bitcoin is so virtuous and wonderful and, causes everything to become right as a result of Bitcoin. It's just that fiat is so awful that oftentimes just removing the awful thing is all that's needed to fix it. And really, Bitcoin gives the opportunity for the awful thing to no longer be there. It's kind of like changing your diet. And maybe you were eating a lot of sugar and smoking and doing all kinds of bad things to your body, and then by changing the diet you stop doing those bad things. Well, that's most of the benefit, right, is in getting rid of the poisonous stuff. And that's what a lot of things are like in the world right now, is that fiat does ruin quite a bit. There are a lot of specific things that I point to in the book, but I've organized it into 4 different layers. So there's the individual layer, all the incentives at the individual level that are altered as a result of the existence of fiat money. Then there is the company level, and unfortunately, that's how we're organized right now. It used to be by family or tribe or something like that. It's now really by company. It's it's the first thing that anyone wants to know when they meet you is so what's your job? What do you do for work? And that in itself is sort of like a hint at the corrupt incentives at that layer. But company level incentives have been altered completely because of fiat money. And then you got nation state level. And this is probably where it's most obvious, because wherever you live, there's some central bank that controls a lot of economic stuff happening, and they are able to print money on behalf of the government. And finally, there's the global level, where we now live under a dollar hegemony because the dollar is the global reserve currency. And that changes so many incentives at the global level. And this is why the US is just so dominant in world politics. So those are the 4 layers at which I talk about fiat ruining different things. And, almost all of it comes down to the fact that somebody can print this money and is constantly stealing in some way, shape, or form. And that's the premise of the book.
Yeah. So when I describe sound money to people, I say, look, I look at money as a proxy for your stored energy. And if somebody else has the ability to create more of it, create more units in the system, then it actually is devaluing your stored energy, which is devaluing you. And so you want to store your energy in something that actually is finite in supply and that grows in purchasing power over time. Let's perhaps jump into an example. I think, because I understand that are you a carnivore, full-on carnivore?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about food because when we look at, I don't know if you've seen those
Hmm.
pictures from sort of like 1950, and then you kind of look at a beach, in sort of
Hmm.
2020, and you just look at the
Hmm.
bodies, and this
Hmm.
the shapes are just completely different. And yet the funny thing is, back then they were eating lots of red meat. They were eating, they had sort of full fat cream, and they were cooking with proper sort of tallow and ghee and
Hmm.
all sorts of stuff. And then we have
Hmm.
this sort of like seed oil sort of
Hmm.
pro-inflammatory side of things. And it's just like
Hmm.
we've got endless amounts of information about what it takes to lose weight and to be healthy.
Hmm.
And so maybe let's like unpick the sort of thread of food and health, and how you see
Hmm.
sort of how fiat has played a negative role there.
Okay, well, so let's start with the sort of like the unspoken third party here, which is the giant agricultural companies that create a lot of this food. And this is something that's common in almost every industry in the fiat world, which is that you have maybe four, five, six large players that determine pretty much everything. And at least as far as food goes, there are giant agricultural companies that control a lot of the food supply. So, how did we end up there? So, let's think about that for a second. Under a fiat money standard, what you get is enormous advantages when you are a very large company. So, if you are a mom and pop farm, you are not going to be able to compete against a giant ag company. And why is that? Well, the giant ag company gets access to commercial loans. They can go out and buy out a lot of farms because they can bring consumption forward instead of out competing the smaller farm. They can just buy them out, and that's what we find is that most farms these days are giant corporation owned farms, and the smallest farms in the United States are still like millions of dollars because it goes towards the companies that have that have size. And this is a dynamic that we see in the fiat world, is that if you are a certain size, you get access to the commercial loan market. You get access to lots of different loans and stuff like that. So you can grow very, very large. Now, what do you do with that size? Well,
Sorry to interrupt, Jimmy. What about
mhm.
subsidies too? The government
Yeah,
can
yeah.
actually say, "Oh, we prefer you, and so we want you to
Mhm.
focus on that." Yeah. Sorry, please carry
Yeah,
on.
well, so when you have access to all this money, what do you do with that money? Well, part of it is exactly like what you said. You can lobby Congress, you can lobby your government, and get laws passed on your behalf. Think about it. If you're a mom and pop shop, you don't have a budget to go and lobby your government. You're too small. But at a certain size, it starts to make sense because you spread the cost of lobbying over all of the different units that you have. So you're a much larger entity, you can afford to spend it. So you get laws passed on your behalf that favor you specifically. So, in the US, for example, it's illegal to sell raw milk, right? This is one of the stupidest things that I can think of. Like, it's two people that voluntarily want to buy and sell. It's not addictive or anything. It's just something that they regulate. So pasteurization, sort of like food, in the name of food safety, you're not allowed to buy certain things that the government determines is unhealthy for you. The other thing that they can do with all of that money is, like I said, buy out their competitors. But the main thing that they do with all of that extra money is scale, because, of course, they are interested in profit. Now, scale can be very good because you can cut the cost of any innovation over many larger units. So, if you can figure out some way of producing a lot of something with like an expensive machine or something like that, that's generally will lower the cost of something. And particularly in an inflationary environment, cutting costs is a constant battle, because the amount of money you're able the amount of real money that you're able to get for your goods is constantly being debased, right? Like, so, but consumers don't want to pay more money. There's a phenomenon called sticky prices. If you see the same good for a larger amount in the grocery store, people don't tend to want to buy it. In fact, they will switch brands and so on. So there's enormous pressure to lower costs, and scale kind of helps with that. But it also makes it so that the technological improvements often aren't enough. They've squeezed out all of the scaling benefits. So what do? Well, they have to start messing with the ingredients. They have to start making things cheaper. And this is indeed why seed oils and sugar have become so prominent, because those are much cheaper than animal fat. They're much cheap, like doing commercial farming, where you're monocropping and stuff like that. That's much cheaper than raising them up in a much more holistic environment and so on. It's much cheaper to do it use like chemicals and things like that to get rid of the bugs that inevitably come out of these things. So the food quality gets debased along with the money because of this pressure to keep the prices down as a large entity. So of course the food has become debased, and indeed, like the government kind of gets involved through with all of the regulation and stuff like that. And a lot of these food companies will support research supposedly showing that fat is bad for you, and that high cholesterol is bad for you, red meat is bad for you, because these things are expensive. So they want an excuse to make their costs cheaper. And of course, this has indeed been the case. Sugar is an extremely cheap product and very easy to scale up. So they've made that a staple, as are seed oil. So a lot of unhealthy things have gotten into our food because of these giant corporations need to continuously debase their food product to keep profits and to keep up essentially with the debasement of the money, and not cause sort of sticker shock in their customers. And yet, despite all of that, food prices have still been going up, and that tells
Yes.
you like just how badly the debasement is. And from a classical inflationary perspective, the best currency currently is the US dollar. And the data that we have on the US dollar goes back to something like 1959, the M2 money supply, which is a measure of all the money that exists. In 1959 was $289 billion. It is currently around 21 trillion. It's increased by a factor of 70 or something like that, and over the past 74 years or so. And if you annualize that, it ends up being about 7%. So the real inflation rate, the real amount of debasement of the US dollar has been about 7% a year. And this is the best currency. If you take all of the fiat currencies and weigh them based on how much of it exists, and look at the global end too, it's more like 14%, which is even worse. So one way to think about it is, if you're thinking about something like food, it's been debasing at 7 to 14%, or minus whatever technological like beneficial scaling improvements that they've been able to make. And you can imagine, even as a very large company, that is a lot of freaking pressure to constantly get 7 to 14% of efficiency, or less cost every year, just so the price can stay the same. And of course, that's not happening, not anywhere close. So they have to debase the food. They have to take shortcuts. They have to make the product worse to sell it at the same price. And we get this illusion that things are getting, maybe a little bit more expensive, right? The CPI is 2% or something like that. That a little bit more expensive, but that the quality is the same. The quality is nowhere near the same. Quality is what gets sacrificed, and that's the dynamic we have, not just in food, but in all kinds of things. As the money debases, generally everything else debases along with it, which is why I say, if fiat ruins everything.
Well, yeah, that's true. To touch on a couple of things you mentioned there, raw milk is illegal here too, by the way. So if you want to if you want to purchase it, you got to buy bath milk, as if you're going to go buy like 200 liters of bath milk and soak yourself in there. And yeah, it is interesting what you say is how there is that sticker shock aspect because the food is also one of those. I mean, food and energy are two of probably the most important things for us. And there is almost this expectation of affordability. And so when I had a look at a full chicken the other day, and it was like it was less than $10 Aussie, so whatever that might be, sort of $6 or $7 US. And you think to yourself, how the hell do you raise and feed something and and have this process for 6 or 7 US? Do you know what I mean? It's just like obviously the economies of scale have gotten so big. So, well, what shortcuts did you necessarily have to take along the way? And then if you think, well, we also know that CPI is just like it's a manipulated government statistic that probably in the sort of, 60s included, whether, it was grass-fed beef and you could probably have like filet mignon and whatever else. And now it's just probably ground beef, corn-fed. And that's sort of the substitution. And even despite that, you're still seeing prices doing what they're doing. Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting articulation of how fiat has ruined the food and then necessarily our health. What's your take on things like, the quality of goods? Like I remember my gran used to have this fridge, and I swear to you, this fridge was 50 years old and was running like a bomb. Yet the quality of products today, is just so inferior. And is this also just speaking to the debasement of the money and constantly having to make compromises in the quality of the actual end product?
Yeah, the thing is, when the money is debasing, when it's getting worse, people will take almost anything, almost anything. They won't demand quite as much from the market, and this is a dynamic that happens because they don't value the money nearly as much. They don't think it'll keep its value, so they will instead buy something. If your money a year from now is going to be worth 7 to 14% less, then of course you're going to be more inclined to spend it now. If you find like a decent deal and not like a great deal, you're going to buy it. And manufacturers have sort of keyed in on this, and they know that they don't need to deliver very good products into the market. In fact, it's often a waste to do a great product because then they're going to not appreciate it, right? Like you could debase the product and still sell a lot of units, so why bother? And that's indeed the specifically in appliances and stuff, people are much more high time preference, right? The people buying the refrigerators, think about who they are. It's often like builders or something for a new home, and you need to put in a new fridge. They don't really care that it's not going to last past 10 years because you put it in there, you sell it, it's no longer your problem. So for them, it's more important to be like kind of superficial about it. And, for a lot of consumers, they can't afford a $2,000 fridge. So what are they doing? Well, they're getting debt to finance this stuff. And for them, they're happy to get a fridge at all because they couldn't afford it anyway. It's not savings. They didn't put their blood, sweat, and tears into it yet. Instead, they're bringing consumption forward through debt, and they'll pay it off later through essentially debt slavery. So they're not going to be nearly as discerning because it's not money that they earned or saved or, sweated for yet. So a lot of confluence of factors comes in, but ultimately what it means is that people are much less discerning, much more high time preference. They are willing to just live for now, get something in their house rather than think about what will be the case like many years from now. And there's quite a lot of evidence that like the manufacturers actually think it's beneficial if it kind of stops running after 10 years, because now they can sell more refrigerators. And they take this dynamic into account. And in many ways, the governments actually like it because they're run by Keynesian economists, and that a broken refrigerator means that they have to spend more money, and they like the money sluicing through the economy, and they don't mind that there's capital stock that is depleting as a result. So for many, many reasons, in the fiat economy, you have the quality of goods degrading. You mentioned refrigerators that used to last way longer. Similar thing with the air conditioners. There are air conditioners that still work from the 50s or 60s. You take anything built in the last 20 years, they don't last more than like 8 or 9 years. Like they just don't. They just various regulations, and once again, it's 4 or 5 large manufacturers of this stuff that control everything anyway, and they often collude with each other and get regulations put in about, Freon is bad, so you have to use this other thing, which is going to make the air conditioner worse and make it go in a dumpster in 9 years, and somehow they sell it as something better for the environment, which is completely ridiculous. But these are the lies that they use to justify essentially a lot of waste that goes from poorly made products.
Totally. It seems now, and like I'm starting to be able to put the pieces together even more clearly in my mind now, is that fiat money leads obviously to high time preference thinking, which funds, which essentially fuels consumerism, that consumerism mindset. Because what's the point of saving your goods, your money? You might as well spend it on stuff. And then you've got a situation where the incentives are such that the actual manufacturers of all these products have an incentive to ensure that in 10 years you replace it. So functional obsolescence is part of the design. It's actually a feature. It's not a bug. They're actually quite happy. They don't want something that actually lasts very long. It's the same reason why Apple, they keep upgrading and they keep bringing new and new products, but they'll change something really small that makes it incompatible with the previous one, like the old chargers story and that kind of stuff. So, those are all the little sneaky fiat tricks that I see. I guess the last thread in this particular vein that I'd be interested to unpack, Jimmy, is the family. One thing I've noticed with Bitcoin is, in particular, is a strong emphasis on the family unit, and it's not self-evident to me why that's necessarily the case, but it's just since I've been in the sector for the last 3 years or so, and just having met a lot of Bitcoiners in real life, like everyone cares about family. Talk to us a little bit about sort of that relationship between, I guess, fiat money, the breakdown of the family unit, and maybe why Bitcoiners care so much about family.
Yeah, so let me just show you my shirt, just so you can see.
There we go.
Yeah.
God, family, country, Bitcoin.
Yeah, there you go. And it's one of my favorite t-shirts because it does sort of like show you that Bitcoin is important. But I think there are other things that are more important. The thing about fiat money that I want to touch on first is that it forces you to be obsessed with it because of the properties that it has. So you mentioned that a lot of people are high time preference because dollars or whatever fiat currency that you're using are very poor stores of value. So instead of saving, it induces a lot of consumption, and you get the consumerist sort of materialist mindset that a lot of people have. But under Bitcoin, if you do have a good store of value, what ends up happening is that, well, you don't need all of this stuff now, and that later on you can get something better. It allows for planning. It lowers your time preference. It helps you think about the future a lot more and price the future more highly. A high time preference person, like a junkie or a very high time preference person like that, they couldn't care less what happens tomorrow. But for somebody that has lower time preference, they care much more about what happens tomorrow. So in a sense, as your time preference lowers, you realize, okay, if I'm thinking ahead, like not just even like a year or two, but like decades from now, well, what are the things that are important decades from now? You might be 25 and it's really fun to go to the club, But is that what you want to be doing at like 45 years old? Like, do you really think you're gonna go have fun like drinking stuff at bars and hitting on girls maybe 20 years younger or something like that? No, you'll
Probably
look
not.
pathetic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the conclusion that most people come to, and for good reason, is family. Is like that. That's the thing that gives a lot of life meaning, because you have this ability to think about the future in a way that's multi-generational. And you talk to any old person, for example, after my parents, for example, they're in their 70s, and they live in a retirement community, not like a nursing home or anything, but they live in a town that's all people that are over 50. They have their own houses and stuff, but they talk to a lot of people, and turns out that there are some pretty well off, well accomplished people there, right? Like these are former doctors or lawyers or politicians and stuff like that. And what they said really struck me, like, like nobody cares about what you did 20 years ago. Like nobody cares. The only things that anyone cares about in this in this community are, one, their health, which kind of makes sense,
Yeah.
because if you don't have your health, like what matters, and two, their kids, right? That their progeny. Those are the only things that people care about, past a certain age, essentially. And if you think about it, like from the ages of 50 to 80, that's like a significant portion of your life. Most people kind of discount that because they're living under sort of a fiat standard where they discount the future so heavily, they don't even think about it. And they think, okay, yeah, I want to go do drugs and play video games all day or whatever, because they're completely discounting the future. But if you start properly valuing the future, one of the conclusions you come to is, I need to have a family. This is what's ultimately going to be more fulfilling. And this is the conclusion that many Bitcoiners have come to, because their time preference has been sufficiently lowered. They realize that, yeah, I'm not going to be doing the same things that I'm doing now 20 years from now. What's going to make my life meaningful 20 years from now? What are the things that I really want to accomplish in this world? And they get after it. Now, not everyone like goes and starts a family. There are other people that get devoted to other things. But generally, this is, kind of biologically what every single one of your ancestors did, because you're there, right? Like the fact that you exist tells you that every one of your ancestors at least had this as a pretty big priority in their life. And where, that's not a surprise. So how do you do that? Well, I guess you can go the artificial insemination route, or surrogate pregnancy or something like that. But generally what people want is a traditional family, because that's the context in which it makes the most sense to raise children, because that's what you're going to be producing. So that to me is why people are so focused on a family. And there's a lot of good things that come out of that, because as I said before, in describing the company level, this is how we get organized in a fiat system. But if you think about these large corporations and stuff, they couldn't care less about you, right? They do not care about you at all.
Of course
But
not.
the traditional sort of grouping that we had, your tribe, your family, your clan, whatever you want to call it, those people cared about you. And that's what made life so much more meaningful. So I think what this focus on family leads to is more of a dependency on the people that you already trust, the family members and the bonds that you have with them. Too many people in a fiat world are willing to just sort of completely let go of their family bonds. I'm sure you know a lot of people,
Yes,
they don't ever
absolutely.
mention their family, right? They don't ever why? Because they can depend on the state, they can depend on their company or whatever from a financial perspective. Now, emotionally, it may not be so much like that. But people are willing to ditch it in large part because of the existence of fiat money, because of the existence of all the various safety nets and stuff like that, that
Mm.
are sort of provided by governments, where you have stuff like welfare and free healthcare and stuff like that. That was never the case historically. You had to depend on your family, and you maybe you had a relative that was a doctor or something like that, and if you
Yeah,
couldn't afford a doctor on your own, well, they would help you out. And if you were out of a job, they would help find you something or maybe even hire you, right? That was how the safety nets were. Family was your safety net.
yeah,
But instead, family has been de-emphasized by fiat money. And really, when you remove a lot of the fiat money things from your life, you realize, okay, I need something like a family. And that's where people go towards. And you mentioned that a lot of people are very into their family, but they're also into having a lot of kids, and
yeah.
it starts making sense once you realize that in a close-knit in any kind of family, each additional person is an asset and not a liability. Under fiat money, children are liabilities, another mouth to feed. And you
You hear
have to give
parents
of
say that.
yourself. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, so why? Because the state provides everything for you. So you providing something to someone else is almost like a foreign concept to a lot of narcissistic, solipsistic people. But in a traditional family, if you without this giant state, that's sort of providing a lot of these artificial safety nets for you, well, each person brings skills and things like that, right?
mm,
I know for myself, like my sister's a lawyer. I call her up when I have like lawyer questions, right? How convenient is that? You don't have to go pay somebody, and who knows what the quality of their advice is going to be. I know my sister cares for me, so if I call her up and ask for advice, that's going to be genuine good advice. And imagine having a doctor in your family, or somebody that knows about cars, or am I getting screwed by this mechanic, or
yeah,
like I want to get some plumbing work done in my house, is this guy screwing me? Every person is an asset in a family, and that's why people had so many children. But under fiat money, they've become liability, so people are having less, and this is part of why you're seeing like lowering birth rates all over the world.
mm,
But when you value family properly, and you don't have all of these fiat weird incentives that come into play at sort of that group level, then you start valuing family a lot more. It's once again kind of like cutting out sugar. When you cut out all of these government safety nets and whatever, you properly value the thing that every other ancestor that you've ever had valued properly, which is family. and
yeah.
and I think that's where Bitcoiners are coming from.
Wow. Yeah. There's so many things you were touching on there that was just like resonating with me big time because
Mhm.
I first migrated to Australia in 2018, and we spent the first couple of years just living our best life, going to wineries and dinners and just living the dream, and we came across Bitcoin in 2020, sort of the heights of the pandemic madness. And I don't know what it was about it, but something triggered soon thereafter this sort of
Mhm.
urge to create a family. And we had never,
Mhm.
it was something that I just kept on going, yeah, one of these days, maybe. And then, I just eventually was like, said to my wife, yeah, like, I definitely want to give this a whirl. And then it's like, no, I don't just want one kid, I want two. I don't know where it's come from. And it's sort of
Mhm.
like maybe it is that sort of looking into the future now and going,
Mhm.
yeah, what really matters? It's like the friends
Mhm.
and family and the community that I've got. And I
Mhm.
had such an interesting chat last week, actually, my previous episode with Peter Dunworth, where we were
Mhm.
just talking about, the amount of people who are dependent on the state. how the state has grown from
Mm.
a small entity that was there to protect private property and potentially just protect the boundaries of the nation or whatever the territory, and maybe a little bit of infrastructure, and then suddenly it's like, okay, well, we'll also do healthcare, and we'll
Hmm.
also do education, and we'll do social security, and well, and then you can just see all the layers and layers of
Hmm.
bureaucracy, and you think to yourself, there's so much, there's so little sort of personal responsibility tied up in that system. There's so
Hmm.
much delegation to the state and to a third party. It's just amazing when I look at just the ethos of Bitcoin, and the people in it, very much centered around personal responsibility and communities. And it's like, you were speaking about, yeah, you've got a sister you can talk to about legal stuff. I feel like, with Bitcoiners, like if I've got a Bitcoin who knows cars, I'll talk to him. I trust him like much, much more than I trust any other mechanic, with
Hmm.
respect. So it is quite amazing how that all ties together there. And yeah, actually, it has been really revealing and sort of just starting from the beginning and just following the
Hmm.
thread, because, yeah, particularly on the family side, it seems as if there is definitely this at least push, and without getting too conspiratorial, from the sort of three-letter agencies of the world, whether it's the WEF or whoever else, to try and say like there's something wrong about having big families. We need to, I mean, first we've got to stop eating beef as a start, but we should have bugs, and then yeah, just stop producing
Hmm.
kids. You'll own
Yeah,
nothing, you'll
and
be happy.
well, so I outlined that on the chapter on families. Actually, Fiat the basis families is let me see, what chapter did I put it in? But it's definitely there. That is chapter 8, Fiat the basis family. So
Okay.
I go into exactly what the conspiracy actually is, and you can trace it all the way back to the Frankfurt School, which is a particularly virulent form of Marxism. I think a lot of people would call it cultural Marxism. That spread from the city of Frankfurt in Germany. So the main point of it was right around that time there was a crisis in Marxism, because Marx had predicted at that with his work that you go from feudalism, you go to capitalism, and then you go to socialism and communism. And he described each transition, and he told people this is what you should watch out for. And the transition from capitalism to socialism was that capitalism would fail, that there would be an existential crisis essentially, and people would rise up in a violent revolution, and then socialism would come into play. And then eventually that would lead to communism, which is workers' paradise. So the thing for those Marxists right around the 30s was there was an existential crisis in capitalism in a lot of these places. So particularly in Europe, you had hyperinflation in Austria, in Hungary, in Germany, and you didn't see socialism rise up. You had the Great Depression in America, and lots of currency crises all over the place, and socialism. There wasn't a violent revolution. So what's going on? How come this isn't happening? So the Marxists weren't going to give up Marxism, right? It's like, oh, this proves Marx, so I'm not going to believe Marxism. That's not how they work. And they sort of latched onto something that Marx had sort of said offhandedly, which was that the family was sort of like an enemy. And they took a lot of the writings of Freud and determined that people had a false consciousness, right? They were too loyal to their family to participate in this violent revolution. And this is what they call critical theory. This is the ancestor of critical race theory, queer theory. A lot of the stuff that we now discuss, like sort of leftist politics.
The identity
But more important,
politics.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, but more importantly, the main sort of claim of the Frankfurt School was that instead of this violent revolution or the class consciousness that would develop in people naturally, you had to train them into it because they were too connected to their family. So in order for people to wake up to their class consciousness, right, to recognize their oppression and rise up in a violent revolution, they needed to be awakened to the oppression of their family. So
Mm.
this is where a lot of the language still exists today. This is what being woke means, right? It's being awakened to your oppression, right? The idea of woke versus non-woke. Well, original now it means kind of like a parody of that, or like as a denigrating thing.
Yeah.
But this was something that was meant as a way to identify people that had freed themselves from sort of the mental bonds of family and could now finally participate in this violent revolution because they were class conscious. They were recognizing that they were part of the oppressed class. So they systematically, from that point on, worked towards the dissolution of the family bonds. And this was a big part of neo-Marx, or the cultural Marxism that was created from that Frankfurt School, and that penetrated academia, that penetrated the media, that penetrated government in many ways. And the policies that you're saying about, like, well, it seems like it's all sort of like debasing the family. It is. It very much is. And it was the explicit goal of the Frankfurt School and all of the people on the radical left that subscribe to that. And I trace it in this book. I describe all of what I'm saying, in that chapter. So it's not a coincidence. It's something that was very, very deliberately planned. And in a lot of socialist and communist countries, this was explicitly sort of like endorsed. So, for example, in Soviet Russia, like they tried to make it so that you didn't have any explicit families, even like sexual morality, especially early on in the communist era. They didn't have family. They were like, you can have sex with whoever they want, and they realized that it caused social chaos, so they reinstated some of that later.
Okay.
And there were many things like that in various countries with the advent of the Frankfurt School, and it continues today. It's the dissolution of the family, the undermining of the family, the debasement of the family is an explicit goal, so that the Marxists can usher in socialism. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of these types are saying, we're coming for your children. Like it's part of their philosophy. It's very much a part of Marxism. Which has unfortunately taken over the mind of way too many people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what's so funny is, I mean, I look forward to reading that chapter, because I spent, probably prior to Bitcoin, I did about 2 years where I described myself as being wrapped up in cultural warfare, even though I'm not from the US, but I was really sort of keyed into what was going on there. And it was very much the situation where I felt like I was a classically trained. I mean, I call myself a classical liberal, in the sense that, I believe in the supremacy of the individual. I don't think like in a collective sense. And when I was like, I didn't leave the left. The left left me. They just went off the cliff. They went crazy. Like I feel like I'm thinking quite straight here. And you sort of point to all these things, and when you say to someone, by the way, there's been this concerted effort for sort of 40, 50 years to try and break up the family, because
100 years, 100 years.
Well, there we go, 100 years. People will say to you, like, that sounds like a conspiracy, but you can actually trace these things back. And then, when you talk about things like, when one talks about the World Economic Forum, and you can go like, you talk about, and, they've got some, like evil agenda, again, you sound a bit crazy, but then you see videos of Klaus Schwab bragging about how he's penetrated all these cabinets. We've got Merkel in Germany, we've got Trudeau in Canada, and you think to yourself, like, it's like these conspiracies are in plain sight, and the evidence is obvious. So yeah, I really look forward to reading your book there, Jimmy. It sounds like there's so many different aspects. I'm conscious of your time, and I just wanted to I wanted to touch on something that's fairly topical, and perhaps you
Mm,
have a little bit of insight. We obviously saw with FTX the whole thing unraveling, partially due to their degeneracy, but also partially because they had their own sort of FTT token. Now, I've been sort of ringing the alarm bells on Binance for a long time,
mm,
and they obviously got their BNB token. I tend to think CZ is probably less degenerate and maybe a bit smarter than SBF, and so I think
mhm.
it's a far bigger sort of edifice to crack. I think it'll fall down eventually, but I think it's going to take a lot longer. What is your take? What's your perspective? Because it seems to me that it feels like there's something brewing that in the next sort of 12 to 24 months could be pretty
Mm.
catastrophic.
Yeah, so much like FTX, Binance has their own token, BNB, and it's actually in the top 10. And the reason why it has such a large market cap is that CZ has been playing this game with new token listings. So anytime anyone wants to list the token on his on Binance, which tends to be a massive price pumping event, he says, well, in order to do that, you have to first of all pay some sort of listing fee, but also hold a significant amount of BNB tokens, right? He created sort of like this artificial demand for BNB tokens, and I'm sure there's some justification, but the reason why the BNB token has such a high market cap is because all of these altcoins that are listing on Binance are forced to buy them. That's why,
Interesting.
right?
Okay, so that's the core demand.
Yeah, that's the core demand, and it's his thing anyway. So he looks like he has a lot of money, and the reason why he's getting in trouble is that he's taken out a lot of loans against his BNB stash. It's a coin he made up, and he's creating this artificial demand by using it as sort of like listing stuff, and as a result, he's gotten a lot of these loans. So I think that's what's getting him in trouble, is that he's been spending money like a drunken sailor using the loans that he's able to get on, because he doesn't want to be selling these tokens because that'll cause the price to drop.
Mm,
Instead, he does what every rich person does in any fiat endeavor, which is instead of selling it and getting hit with capital gains taxes and all that stuff, just takes out a loan against whatever property and uses that money instead. And this is also why I think BNB token, as it goes down, it gets defended so heavily on Binance, because there's a liquidation point for the loans he has, but not just him, probably the company and many others. So there's a natural interest for him to defend that peg. But as with most pegs, it only lasts until it breaks, right? It's gradually then suddenly. So it's kind of what happened to FTT. I think Sam Bankman-Fried had like a similar mechanism going on over there, and he definitely took out loans against the FTT balance that his company held, and so on. And that was also why he was spending money like a drunken sailor. So I suspect that the same dynamic will happen. It's just that CZ has been running this scam for longer, and he's been able, and he wasn't quite as profligate, I guess, as SBF. But I think, yeah, I think the collapse is inevitable, and we'll see exactly how it ends.
totally. Yeah, absolutely. Like one of the interesting things I tell people was during my time working in shitcoin media, Binance was one of our biggest sponsors. So whenever there was a red flag, I would try and run a story on them, and it was like, no, you're not allowed to. But I've been watching them closely, and to your point, I don't think CZ is quite as much of a reprobate as SBF, and I think him and the sort of all the folks who are sort of hyped up on Adderall, I think got over their skis very quickly. Whereas I think CZ's a little bit more smart. I think you could even say he thinks like the art of war, that kind of stuff, Sun Tzu. So maybe he's smarter, but I think what would have been smarter, and I saw this tweet the other day and I thought it was actually genius, was like, all these crypto people need to do is just not take out leverage. That's all they need to do. Is just keep their shitcoin casinos alive and literally don't take out leverage. And that's all they need to do to become mega wealthy. But unfortunately, the high time preference thinking sort of permeates their brain. They want more and more and more and more. And yeah, to your point, like, if you're going to be leveraging up against something you've created of thin air, eventually speculators are going to be coming after you. And yeah, I do look forward to that day, but I do know overall it's going to be a bit of a bloodbath for Bitcoin that day too. But I guess we don't really care what happens in the short term.
In a sense, you can't blame them because this is how things work in the fiat world. You get to a certain size, you get access to loans, and you grow and grow and grow. And you have to be one of the 3 or 4 winners in your segment, or you die. This is the nature of a lot of fiat companies, is that you need loans to survive, you need leverage to survive, and you need to get to a certain size. So he played that game exactly. And Binance is one of the biggest exchanges in the world for that reason, because he used those loans to grow his company, and he used the mechanics of fiat essentially to take advantage, and he created essentially the biggest exchange in the world. But it was always built on sand, just as most fiat companies are. And this is the problem. It's not just Binance. I argue in the book that companies don't make that much profit anymore. And the reason is, if you are a company that makes, pretty nice margins, here's what happens. There's a private, there's usually some sort of hedge fund or, some large fund of some kind. And they will do what's called a leverage buyout. They will buy your company, and of course, like, that's very tempting. You don't have to work anymore, and you get full value for whatever company that you have. So the owners oftentimes will take that deal. Okay, so say you had like 30% margins on whatever you were making. It's a very profitable company. Well, they do a leverage buyout. What does that mean? They take out loans, and they have to pay interest on those loans. And they put it on the company's balance sheet. So instead of a 30% margin, now it's maybe like a 15% margin, because the other 15% now go towards servicing the debt. So suddenly what used to be very profitable is now only moderately profitable. And guess what? You get some sort of disruption, something happens in the supply chain or something like that. Suddenly you're now down to 5%. And okay, what do we do now? Well, you find another company looks at the numbers and says, okay, well, 15%, all things considered. All right, they do another leverage buyout, right? And put even more debt on the company balance sheet, and end up with like a 5%, profit. Still profitable, so they're like, okay, this will still make us money. Unfortunately, that makes them extremely fragile. So what used to be a 30% cushion on your profit margin, now you're subject to all kinds of supply chain disruptions, all sorts of different disruptions of any kind, right? Like it could be political, it could be regulation related, it could be taxes, whatever. And then next thing you know, you don't have a profit margin anymore. In fact, you're starting to lose money, and loans can tide you over for a time, but this is how you die, right?
Yeah.
And and this is not an unknown sort of way for companies to die. Toys R Us was bought by Bain Capital with a leverage buyout, so they used to have pretty decent profit margins, but Bain Capital, with their leveraged buyout, put the debt on the Toys R Us balance sheet. So suddenly their profit margin shrunk tremendously. And they could no longer really operate profitably because they had this giant debt hanging over their head. And of course they went bankrupt. So this is the problem with all of these fiat games is, we laugh at Binance and say, how could they do something so stupid? This is just how it's done in the fiat world. This is completely normal to sort of expand at all costs while taking on oodles and oodles of debt. This is bringing consumption forward, right? Like traditionally, what you had to do to expand was to save off of your profits and then reinvest into your business and grow that way organically. Instead, you have this giant debt facility that you have access to, and essentially you're in debt. You're enslaved to the bankers as a company. And that's what most of these companies are at this point. It's
Yeah.
kind of sad, but that's how it is.
Yeah, to your point of Binance just responding to the incentives, I think I often point to an example here of the real estate market in Australia, widely known as one of the most overblown and overheated, but the government will do everything in its power to ensure that the bubble doesn't pop. We saw during COVID, the market ran hot, up about 45%, at least where I live in Brisbane. Now, what happens if you were the poor schmuck who thought that what your gran had said was smart? Don't live beyond your means, save as much as you can, and eventually you'll be able to put down enough of a deposit. What actually made sense between sort of 2019 and 2022, let's say, was put down a 5% deposit at 2% finance, because you've automatically seen a 40% uplift in capital values, and you did nothing. You did nothing. The poor schmuck who saved, diligent, that person is now even further behind the curve, and eventually will have to bite the bullet and take debt. And that's just the way it is. So the incentives are all aligned for you to play the game of just taking on debt, because otherwise you'll just never get ahead. So yeah, I haven't actually thought about it in that sense, with CZ doing what he's basically just is totally predictable and expected within the fiat system. Jimmy, last question before we roll today. We're sort of in the I saw something today where it said, like, this is the longest bear market we've ever had. And I mean, it's my first, I don't know to what extent that's accurate, but it said something like we're sitting at like, say, 500 days or so compared to just some of the historical data. And look, I think from my perspective, it's my first serious bear market. And luckily I've done all the work. I've got a lot of conviction, and it's an opportunity to stack sats. That's the way I'm looking at it. But I think in terms of bringing on mass adoption, the average retail investor, what are some of the bullish signals you're looking at the moment that would give the average person sort of sufficient incentive to perhaps start doing some work now while it's relatively affordable compared to where it could be in sort of 12, 18 months or wherever it goes?
Yeah, so this is completely normal from a historical perspective. This is the down part of the cycle. Typically, the nadir is about somewhere between 6 and 12 months before the halving. We're going to have the halving. That supply shock generally takes a while to percolate through the market. So 6 to 12 months after the halving is usually when the bull market is. So I would prepare for that. Historically, that's been the case, and there is some reasonable explanation for why that is, because there is a supply shock. There isn't as many new Bitcoins coming online after the halving, but that takes some time for it to percolate through the market in terms of supply and so on. Now, there's obviously a lot of noise on a day-to-day basis because there's a lot of speculators and so on. But over the long term, you know what's happening. The supply is more or less fixed, and the new ones coming online are reducing. But demand tends to go up. So any uptick in demand after the halving is going to be supercharged as there's less new Bitcoin coming on the market to fill that demand. So you're going to see more of an uptick. So it's a hard money, and this is what scarce assets. This is how they behave. It goes up, it goes down, and that's just kind of how it is. I would caution thinking too much about global adoption or things like that, because in a sense, a lot of people make a fetish out of that. And from my experience, the people that stick with Bitcoin, the people that are what we call diamond hands, right? The real holders, the holders of last resort. They're the ones that are actually convicted on this stuff because they really know it thoroughly, and it takes typically years of study to get to that point. And You have some extraordinary people that got there in like 6 months. I could think of two right now, Russell Kung and Michael Saylor. But vast majority of people, they dabble in altcoins, whatever, and maybe they read the Bitcoin standard eventually and think about it, and it takes a lot of time, and you're not going to get a bunch of people to understand Bitcoin because you gave them a little bit of Bitcoin, right? Like that's not how it works. So I would just encourage you to keep trying to orange pill people by having these conversations and talking about the long road, because in a sense the altcoin stuff is completely a trap, and it's very easy to get bogged down in that and think that that's all there is. And unfortunately, many people don't make it out of there. But once you get to Bitcoin and you really understand it, that's where new holders are made, and that's what we should be focused on, and not sort of like retail and the people that are just going to speculate and get in and get out in like 3 months or something like that. At the end of the day, that's all noise. The people that matter are the long-term holders.
Amen. Awesome. Jimmy, it's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure to chat to you. I really appreciate your time. Won't you please tell folks where they can find you, where they can get hold of your book? I know sometimes in Australia, things are a little bit slow here in terms of getting access to some of these things, but perhaps just share that with the audience.
Yeah, so fiatruinseverything.com is where I will be marketing this book. As of this recording, which is September 5th, I'm still running a crowdfund until September 6th. So I'm pretty sure this will air after September 6th. So the website will probably have links to stuff that you can buy, but it won't be part of the crowdfund. Now, as far as the where you can buy it, it's already available on Amazon in the United States. I suspect that since it's probably print on demand or something like that, it's probably available in Australia. I'm not entirely sure, but the ebook will be out regardless in the next few weeks. And at that point, you'll be able to at least download it and read it. And, maybe I can see some of you at a conference or something and sign a book for you. So there you go.
Perfect. Awesome. Jimmy, thanks so much. Appreciate you, man. And have an awesome one.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that you got some value out of it. Either way, hit me up on Twitter and let me know what you think. My handle is Dale21M. If you've got any suggestions as to people you think I should be talking to or topics I should address too, I would love that sort of feedback. Otherwise, if you want to support the show, there's a couple different ways you can do that. The first is just to share it amongst your friends and family. The more that people hear the message that Bitcoin and crypto are not the same thing, the better. And I want to help people understand that. The second thing you can do is give me a 5-star review on whichever podcast app you're using. Of course, that's only if I deserve it. And last but not least, if you want to stream sats my way via the Fountain app, I'm not going to say no, but it's not expected. Thank you so much for your support thus far. It means the world to me. I appreciate the hell out of you, and the best is yet to come. Much love, friends. I'll see you on the other side.